Thank you, sir. And you didn't take credit for me moving here this time. Usually you.
I will take credit for that.
Thanks, Vic. And I want to know who's out here, too. How many folks work for large companies? Okay, so about a third. Who works for kind of a mid-sized company, somewhere in that middle range, sub 100 million? Anyone? Who has startups? Who have? Okay, lion's share. Some people raise their hands twice. I don't know what that is. No, and that's interesting. So we struck out, like what Vic was saying, a handful of years ago, before we called it this big sweeping name here, the World Database of Innovation. And Mayo Clinic asked us, as Vic was saying, a very innocent question. They said, "Oh, just go figure out here. Here's a little bit of cash. Go figure out how big companies innovate." And what they were really asking for was a best practice database and a set of best practices, at least, and research behind how do large human organizations innovate. So how does a large group of people come together, organize itself, and actually repeatedly put innovations out to the world? So not once, not twice, but they were, so they were incredibly interested in the 3Ms of the world who have done it for 150 years, and less interested in Google, although they're pretty incredible, of course. So this is what we did. So we studied 2,000 companies over the last 10 years. We had 300 thought leaders, everybody from Clay Christensen to Tim Brown from IDEO. I see some head nods, some folks recognize those names. Larry Keeley at Dublin, a bunch of folks who are on Mayo Clinic's board of directors, and they all kind of guided us in this thing. And what we found really as we went into this is that there was just a lot of bull out there in the world around innovation. And I think this is what you allude to, Vic, when you talk about you couldn't find anything. And we expected to be able to go out, and I think with the small amount of money they paid us, they expected us to be able to go out, find a bunch of other people's research, pull it together, and write a white paper. That was really that. And so here we are 10 years later. It says 2,000, and we just struck out to actually study the top, as in the largest 20,000 companies in the world, and we're actually building a Wikipedia or an Innopedia online that will actually mass source data on how large human organizations innovate. So that's what we were up to. In that study, we found 105 innovation practices, and we found, as we ran the stats on this, so you'll see I'm a big geek, and I try to avoid the geeky side of these things if I can. We found that of those 105 practices here, 27 of them were statistically significant or had a high R value for the scientists out there, or statisticians. So we look for R values of 50% or higher. And so that means that technically, if you use these 27 or some subset of them is a better way to go, you should be able to have a higher probability of repeatedly innovating. So I'm going to go through all that, and I'm going to try not to get too geeky today. Because we have a nice kind of more intimate setting here, just stop me as we go or let me run. I've got about 15, 18 minutes, kind of TED Talk style, I can run through this, but I'm happy to stop anywhere or come back at the end. And I'm going to run you through basically a visual of all of our data that we built in partnership with 3M, who is one of our longstanding members and founders of our organization. So what is this innovation thing anyway? There's hundreds and hundreds of definitions we found out there, and these are not right or wrong. These are ours. These are just the ones we prefer. They happen to be the ones that high growth companies of the world share in common, these definitions, and we'll talk more about that. So an innovation, just so we're on the same page here, an innovation for us is a noun. It's something that has already changed the world on a wide scale, changed human behavior on a wide scale, as opposed to, say, a cool idea, a startup, or an invention, which is may have the potential to become an innovation, something that changes human behavior, but has not yet, or maybe is sitting on a shelf, like a whole bunch of, you alluded to the federal labs earlier. A lot of amazing technology sitting on shelves there, although not so much in Colorado, which is awesome. There's a lot of good commercialization work. And then separately from that, innovation management. So innovation management is the whole system you create, or the engine, or the roadway inside your organization, that allows you to repeatedly innovate. So it's actually the system, and that's really what we found and what we studied on. Why innovate? There's two reasons. This may seem obvious, so I'll go through it fast. Don't go out of business is one of them, and the other one is actually be able to be in charge of your future. and maybe even your entire industry's future, and maybe even shape your industry in a way that favors you as in your company. And I won't go into the rest because we'll come back. So what we've done with our data over the last number of years is we've built this innovation management maturity curve so we can actually score companies, and we're doing this for some Wall Street firms now. We can actually score companies and talk about what is their probability, a scale of 0 to 100%, of repeatedly being able to innovate. And again, as Vic was saying, that means significant leaps in top-line growth. So we're really specific about this because it's about outcome. So top-line growth, significant leaps. We look at companies and their revenue growth over time, and we look for the companies that have this, a lot of this. And the other one is market share, which is good, and sometimes good by volume, but more interestingly, profit share. So those are the three key leading innovation metrics we look for in these companies. And again, that's a likelihood score of repeatedly innovating. So I'll go up and down the curve and give some examples here. So you see down here at the bottom, it's a little hard to read. That's controlled data. They sort of don't exist anymore. How many people were aware that my home state of Minnesota was the supercomputer center of the world? So like barely a handful of folks in the room. And I notice the folks that raised their hands are a little older also. And so I worked actually in the beginning of our research with a bunch of the former control data folks to understand why the heck did this organization full of incredibly smart people with some amazing innovation systems, why did it not prevail? What happened there? Best Buy, they're interesting. Why are they not down at the bottom of the curve here with their market performance as you're looking? They have some interesting DNA inside the company as you look at it, and we've actually written some pretty interesting white papers with former execs there. Here's an oddity. We actually put another kind of human organization here. As we were doing our studies, we found that that's what we were studying is human organizations, not just companies, but how do groups of people. And so a society, a region, and this is one thing we've started talking about a little bit, is how do we take all these amazing assets that Colorado has and actually start tying them together into a true innovation engine, something that hums. And that's obviously what you work on and what you work on, Mike. Very interesting stuff. So the U.S. is sitting here in the middle of the curve. Historically, we've been at the top. Vic alluded to this. We have incredible performance still, and we have some serious threats in our culture, in our regulation systems, in our funding and how that works. And if you actually look at the overall entrepreneurial activity, number of products being put out by large companies, the success of those products, we're actually on a serious decline. And it really is a pretty serious thing. Apple, you'll see here in the middle of the curve. Some people yell at me about that one. I would love for some of you to yell at me and for us to have a debate on that. I think it's very interesting. 5-10 years ago, I might have put them up here higher in the curve. Google's a real interesting one. One big innovation, right? One thing that's really changed human behavior on a wide scale, and they're still capitalizing on that. They're growing their revenue incredibly on that. But it's interesting. It's one innovation. They have hundreds of others coming, an incredible system. The reason, even though it's only one innovation that they've been capitalizing on, is that they have those systems. So we score them pretty high on the maturity curve here. As you move up it, some surprises in here. Most people don't even know Pernod Ricard. Does anyone know Pernod? Yeah, okay, so we got a couple of folks. So Diageo is their big competitor. This is the French company, and so they own Glenlivet and a lot of the scotches and Absolute vodka and champagnes. And they have built a new innovation system that is absolutely incredible. They've also been doing this for, I think it's more than 150 years, actually, as a company. We love these smaller, quiet Midwestern companies. I'm biased, obviously, being from there. But Johnson Controls, most people don't even know of, did a 50% in 18 months, 50% of top-line growth goal, and they actually made it to about 75%. Incredible innovation system that backed that up. 3M, we all know, and you'll see I use a lot of 3M examples because they've actually helped us build these data tools you're looking at, and Intel, some really incredible systems. And then sitting here at the top of the curve, we have this sort of ideal state, and we've really never seen a company hit 100% before. I'm sure some companies have at points in history, but we have yet to find these. And as you dive in here, and then so now we're going to dive into some of the research, and I'll get into some of the specifics. And again, just stop me as we go. This is a diagram of a company. So you have your core business. You can't read here maybe. Is it called an incremental growth engine? This is your lean group, your Six Sigma groups, product groups who are working on changing colors, adding features, efficiency. So people who are changing existing products, existing offerings. and other things. And humans are very comfortable with this kind of incremental change to things we already know. Henry Ford quote, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. A lot of you probably, yeah, I see a lot of nods, heard this one. That's good. And so about 99% of most businesses' expenses are around supporting the core and actually reinforcing and trying to sell more of old goods, things that have existed. Up here in the top, this is innovation management, and this is the realm in which we work. And I'll come back at the end here to why this bubble is sitting outside the core company. You probably have some good guesses. Innovation management, just a quick reminder, definition, it's a system that makes future top-line growth, again, or profit share or market share, a reliable and repeatable practice, these leaps in growth. And we say here also the advancement of humanity. So if you think about social organizations, governments, a lot of whom we've worked with, they're actually looking at changing human behavior for different reasons and in different ways. So thought, beliefs, action, how we interact with each other and all sorts of things. The problems that these organizations face, and we've worked with NASA and a lot of the US government bodies, the European Union and their investment bank on these kinds of things. Actually the state of Minnesota, hopefully more here in Colorado as we move and do more here with Vic and everybody in the room. So advancement of humanity, so advancement of the human condition. So now I'll talk about our 5 different areas. I mentioned earlier we have 27 things we found that these large companies, these really fast-growing, these repeat innovators share in common. Those 27 things are the small bubbles inside here. You can kind of ignore, we'll follow it because it's easier to talk about things. These 5 structures, belief systems, process, like the innovation process itself, talent or HR, talent management, and cultural aspects. And so these are just convenient organization. A lot of these things you'll see repeated several times actually in different buckets here. And the correlation here, so I'm going to get geeky for a second, the bigger the bubble, the more significant it was, the higher the R value, as in it was more indicative or correlated with companies who are able to grow, able to innovate on a repeated basis. So under structures, structures is the biggest one. It was the most significant, and a lot of the things in here you'll see the circles are even larger. So 72% of the high growth companies, the repeat innovators over long periods, have an I team, that's just our cute name for innovation team. That's a central team. So 72% of these companies actually have a centralized innovation team that has a fairly structured way of managing innovation across the organization. And it's usually a central body, or at least within the business units. If it's a very large company, again, like a 3M, who I'll come back to a lot here, it may be sitting within the business. But either way, it's an enterprise-wide innovation team that's organizing it. Employee connectivity, this is a really interesting one. We were born out of Mayo Clinic, and 3M, obviously, right down the road from us there, we learned a lot from. And employee connectivity ended up being a very, very high correlation, like 80+% of these companies have high levels of connectivity between their employees. One of the 3M scientists actually ran his own analysis so he could invest his own money in companies. And this is the only metric he used to invest. And so he looked at different companies and how many patents, he did it from a very unique perspective, how many patents were shared between employees across the company, and he used that as a way to analyze how connected is the company, how many people are collaborating. And this is one of the highest correlation values. So companies that have high connectivity do much, much better. Can anybody guess why that is? So many people talk about collaboration, very few people talk about why it matters. Yeah, go ahead.
When you get a creative group together, you get a lot of critical thinking.
Yeah.
And you challenge each other.
Absolutely.
And I think that pushes the envelope.
And what does that produce? When you say push the envelope, what does that do, you think?
New ideas.
New ideas.
New concepts.
An agreement.
Agreement.
Transparency.
I think you raised your hand earlier.
I was just saying, it's the whole notion of the departure from the industrial age, which took away the employee creativity, making them an extension of the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the inverse of that, giving the employees their brains back.
Giving the employees their brains back, yeah. And all of those things are incredibly right. And what we found very specifically, and it fits everything you guys are talking about, is that every innovation is a combination of 2 old things in a new way with a new business model. And the more connected your people are internally, and we're not talking about business units, we're talking about individual people, the way they can connect with each other, the more connected they are, the more likely they are to combine ideas and actually make new things. And everybody knows the Post-it note concept. Oh, you have a glue that's, and that was actually sort of true. So if you talk to Art Fry, who's the Post-it note guy, it took him 10 years to get that through 3M. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But that connectivity, it was actually part of what created that. And I can tell you all about the systems they built for that, very simple homegrown systems. I alluded earlier to the definition for innovation. The high-growth companies of the world shared a shockingly. So a lot of what we talk about here is really intuitive, right? You're going to nod your head, I'm guessing, a lot, and say, "Oh yeah, of course, that makes a lot of sense." We don't do that maybe, but it makes a ton of sense. And some other things were you may get there in the end, but were really fun surprises for us. So I think it was 67% of the high-growth companies shared almost the exact same definition for innovation. Like shockingly similar definitions for innovation. And we think that works and that is important because you got to get everybody on the same page and you got to be able to do the next thing on here. So, well, the circle you can't see over to the right here is metrics. You got to be able to set your metrics right. So the definition is your qualitative description of what's in and what's out. What are we working on and what are we not working on? And the metrics show you exactly what are we performing against. What do we hope to produce out of these things we've defined. And so the definition for innovation, that was a fascinating one. Jumping over to belief systems, kind of probably the area where we had the most fascinating or surprising kind of things. Yeah, please.
Sorry to interrupt. But under structures, do you also have something like constraints?
Constraints. Are you asking, or did you see it up here?
I'm asking.
Yeah, constraint-based innovation.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
constraints definitely drive innovation.
Absolutely.
So I'm just wondering, is it under structures or where is that?
It's under structures, belief systems, under process. You'll see I'll hit on it in a few minutes. I wrote a piece on it because I think it's such an important piece of the innovation process is actually having constraints. And if you don't actually have constraints on you, which most big companies don't, and most of the cultures aren't developed around constraint-based innovation, you essentially don't get anything. And we just wrote a piece on how Arctic explorers and the people doing the crazy extreme sports, how they're inventing incredible new technologies because it's life or death situations, and which is life or death. It tends to be the biggest constraint, and it drives incredible inventiveness. So we just wrote that piece for Fast Company, and that was a blast. The piece we wrote for Harvard, you'll see, is called Scarcity, and we think that's a terrible name for it. That's what the editor forced on us. What you said, constraints, that's actually the right way to think about it. Yeah, that's a great question. And so, well, I'll come back to that a little bit too. You'll see me hit on it and stop me again if I don't. Belief systems, very soft, hard to quantify, hard to even describe some of these things. And so this actually is more emerging in our research, but it's incredible to be able to build stats behind how companies think. And if you don't think correctly, you're never going to be able to innovate. Like a real big one, we can't manage innovation is actually sort of a cultural agreement that we have in the US at least. And obviously, if you don't think you can manage innovation, you probably aren't going to try to do it. And so there's an obvious one. But some other ones, asking the big question, companies that actually continually ask themselves, what business is it that we're in? And that was actually the question, almost the exact question and wording that we found a lot of these companies doing. And then the answers were almost more interesting than the actual question. So what business is it that we're in? The old school, so if we use, we wrote a piece on Essilor. Essilor does the eyeglasses out of France. Their old answer was, we sell eyeglasses. As they moved into India and tried to sell these eyeglasses that were $180, and you see the optician and their whole business model, fancy spaces, high design, $180 to up to $1,000, whatever you're spending. That's in euros probably too for the most part for Essilor. So much higher dollar amounts. As they moved into rural India, they realized that the business they were actually in was providing sight and providing freedom. And they actually redefined, so those kinds of answers, just kind of listen to those, the kinds of answers they were giving redefined who they were as a business, and actually led them to be able to discover that they didn't actually need the optician in the business model, and they were able to make a profit on selling $1 and $2 glasses. So it was $1 for off-the-shelf kind of set prescriptions, and then custom was $2, and they were actually able to make money on those by redefining who it was that they were. I mean, absolutely incredible. Procter & Gamble is a great example of this one, risk management exercise. How many of you think your company looks at innovation as a risky endeavor? No one? Usually it's everybody. Maybe I asked the question wrong today. But risk management exercise. So one of the things that P&G did, and a couple of our board members from there who led innovation really introduced us to, and then we found great stats around this, is they actually try to change the entire framework of thinking. So actually most humans look at investing in something that we have no idea what it's going to do as a risky endeavor, right? And if you look at it on an individual basis, that's true. Most big companies however, are investing in hundreds, or should be investing in hundreds of different new potential products and technologies at the same time. And therefore should be treating it like a portfolio, and it should actually become a risk management exercise as opposed to a risky endeavor. And actually, because of this kind of finding, we actually have more and more CFOs who usually are the block or in the way of innovation in the company. A lot of companies name that as their number one challenge, is getting innovation funded, are actually engaging with us because they are coming to understand how you actually manage risk in these. And we'll come back to that in a bit too. The innovation process. This is where we have 7,700 consultancies in our database. 6,200 of those consultancies focus on the innovation process, and usually just one part of it, which is inventing new products. And so you've all seen this cycle. There's nothing very unique here. You discover a market opportunity, you invent a product or a solution for it, you improve that thing, you socialize it inside your company. This was an interesting point. We found that most of the stats out there showed that in this marketplace, that's where things failed. We actually found that of the 90% of things that fail out here at the market phase, not back here because somebody said they were crappy, it's actually here in the politics of the company these things get killed. And so human organizations are built, again, to support the old products, right? So what do people do when they're supporting old products and they get paid to do that, and all their KPIs, all their reporting metrics? They protect that space, and they usually say no to new things. That's just one of 100,000 ways that large companies, large human organizations actually standardize out, simply kind of innocently, right? They standardize out the possibility of innovation. So that's the cycle here, but I'll dive into a couple pieces of it. The invention methods. So we found a lot of the high growth companies have these toolkits, and it's kind of our name for it. Who knows design thinking? That's kind of the most popular one. Yeah, we got some hands raised. So these are really structured thinking. Who knows brainstorming? Everybody knows brainstorming, right? Yeah. So these are the kinds of things we're talking about here. We found that the high growth companies tended to have a toolkit, so basically a holster with 3 or 4 of these invention methods, like the ones we were talking about. So we went out and we found 152 of these methodologies. Design thinking gets all the press because Roger Martin and IDEO and those guys are incredible marketers. But there's literally 151 others so far that we found. Everything from the myth of the epiphany to TRIZ. Has anybody heard of TRIZ, the Russian version? Yeah, so some engineers especially, it's so burdensome. It's an amazing evidence-based product development and engineering problem-solving structure, but it's so burdensome no one uses it. So we categorized what these things are good for, how they work. Design thinking, for instance, came out of the architecture world. It's incredible for hard goods. It's not so good at services or business models, although it can be used there. Alex Osterwalder has done the business model generation thing, has a whole process for inventing business models. And a lot of Porter's work and others around this have these things. But the big companies we found have these invention methods, and we can come back and dive into those too. In this take to market area, we found some really interesting things. Almost every single one, I think it's 90-some percent, 98%, have a kill function. And so who has a way in their company of deciding when to retire an old product versus having the market kill it for you? Like an active decision, right? Very few companies have it. All of the fast-growing companies had this. It was really interesting. So they actually make a decision, we are going to kill this product. We are going, and very specifically, even better, we're going to obsolete ourselves before someone else does it to us. And so they're actually inventing the future product of the company before these things die. Thomson Reuters did an incredible thing with Westlaw Next. Anybody a lawyer in the room? Yeah, we got one or two. And there are some lawyers who actually know how to innovate, so maybe you're one of them. one of the lawyers at Thomson Reuters did this incredibly. So Westlaw was out. Westlaw was leading the market. It was the most profitable. They actually had the biggest volume as well. So they had profit and market share. And I think they had something like 60% of the market already. And this guy saw, people say he read the tea leaves. Andy Martins is his name. But he actually went out and just looked at the trends in the market, looked at all the free information coming. And I don't know, I want to say it was 9 years ago or so, maybe almost 10. He actually got out in front and he had to go over his boss's head to sell this idea. It was absolutely incredible. Flew to New York, went over his boss's head and said, hey, this thing is going to be, we're going to have somebody, not just our competitors, but literally Google, obsolete us entirely unless we revamp it. They revamped it and they actually ended up taking more profit share. They actually put a premium price on it and took more profit share. It was a really incredible move, and they killed their old product. I think that was one of the more incredible pieces. And they did it on a really defined schedule, so it didn't happen to them. They actually managed the retirement of that. Talent management, so HR, how you manage people, how you recruit people. Very hard to find statistics around this stuff. We found some really interesting things. So the theme we could really find here isn't very specific, but it's incredibly interesting. Large organizations are, by design, in the way of people doing new things. Because you want to standardize, right? And standardization is how you scale. And so, very innocently, it leaves no room for anything else. People are inherently, and there's just tons and tons and tons of good data that isn't ours on this, people are inherently inventive. And when they're forced to, when there's necessity, when there's constraints, as you were saying earlier, people will be inventive. And the most surprising people in the world you'll see, who you just say they're the least creative, they will actually get very resourceful when they have to. Everybody, really. And so companies really just need to pull the stops out and enable folks. Yeah, please.
Where do you factor passion in that process?
Well, there's a lot of answers there for you. And there's a lot of places in here we could put it. Where would I put it here? Pulling out the stops allows them to act on their passions is one piece of it, and enabling them, and very specifically, giving them time, money, and expertise to help them launch their idea. That's how you enable. That allows people to actually act on their passion. So it ends up being really great for engagement of employees, really, really good for retention. That was a huge part of why 3M introduced a lot of those measures. 15% free time. They had a funding bucket that allowed people to go in and say, I want to work on this new thing. So they're protected from leadership. They can't be told not to do things. They actually have protected space for that so that they can follow their passions. And that's why people stay at 3M, at Johnson Controls, at some of these places for, well, their entire lives, literally. It's incredible how many people they have over 30 years. And actually, that's a great segue into the recognition system. So reward system, as in paying people for innovation. After people make $70,000, it actually can be a disincentive or wrongly incent people is probably the better way to say it, to do things you don't want them doing. The recognition system, so awards, medals. I know at a lot of companies that are engineering based, it tends to be number of patents on the wall and being recognized for that work. These are the kinds of systems in HR that really work, and it follows the principles, right, too, of getting out of people's way and enabling them. And then very specific things, just having innovation on key leaders' scorecards, their personal scorecards and their performance records. Most companies, this is a really simple one. Most companies don't do this. Most of the high growth companies, however, do this. And they actually put it, and they find the right middle managers who tend to be the biggest inhibitors of innovation. They actually put innovation metrics where appropriate, not everywhere, of course, on their scorecards. And culture. So even harder to quantify. And so you started talking about this. DaVita hosted our kickoff for Innovators Colorado, and we actually brought all of the global members there. So they hosted, and because DaVita has such a strong culture, everyone's talking about it right now. And you've all heard the old quote, probably, culture eats strategy for lunch. And I think that's very true. It's fascinating what we found here, however, is that most culture, while it is set by leadership and the tone of leadership, the authenticity which they bring, the different philosophies and values of the company to the group, all those things are incredibly important. the only way to change cultures was really to change structures. And it really came back to the same things we just talked about. KPIs, like what are the reporting metrics for each individual? What are you rewarding them for? And if you think about it, it's just common sense, right? People only do what they're rewarded for or not slapped for doing. So, so these structures, and there's many different structures. So I just talked about KPIs, but there's tons of others that we found that were being employed by these companies to change their culture. And so if you've ever been part of a culture change project, there's often ones that come in and they try to do trainings and they try to socialize values, and these are very effective things. Those projects on average took 10 years to shift a culture meaningfully. 3M did this. Our members from United Health Group are in the middle of this right now. But these structural changes almost had immediate effect. And if you think about that, if you start rewarding people differently, they're going to immediately act. So they're not going to wait 10 years to wait for new ideas to be accepted inside the company. And then I'll end with, and we can go back through any of this you'd like, the accepting or harsh environment. So this is probably not what you think. We actually found that whether an organization had a culture that accepted new ideas or if it was harsh to new ideas, had absolutely no determination of whether the company did well in the market and was able to crank out new innovations. And the reason for this is that those structures we were talking about, having the funding, the brain space, having people who can help you launch your new thing, those structures, those are actually the things that mattered. And so, again, going back to Art Fry and the Post-it note at 3M, it took him 10 years to actually get that through the company. And if you have ever worked with 3M, it's an extremely harsh environment for new ideas. And it shocks the heck out of everybody on this one. But they have structures in place that make that harsh culture just not matter. And it's incredibly effective. And I guess I lied. I have one more thing. So I told you at the beginning I'd come back to why this innovation management team or structure is sitting outside the core company. There's a really great article from the 90s by Tushman and O'Reilly called The Ambidextrous Organization. And they talk about how your innovation team, so skunkworks, you've probably all seen, most of the time fail in large companies, not because they're not a good idea, mostly because of visibility in politics. But they almost always fail, these skunkworks. There's some great examples of ones that have worked, of course. These are just statistics. What does work on average is actually have an innovation team that touches the company and can pull resources, because this company has amazing resources. You have business unit leaders who may be managing a 30-year-old product, but actually they probably have some really great ideas too, because again, humans are inventive by design, and it's very satisfying for people. So the passion thing that you were talking about earlier. So the innovation team needs to be able to draw from the business. Somebody may have seen the CEO reporting. Almost every fast growth company has the innovation team reporting directly to the CEO, not to R&D. And that's part of the structure. So it sits outside here. It can't be contaminated by the culture. It has its own space, its own speed. The innovation team probably has its own culture, but it's deeply connected to the company, and there's good visibility between both. And those are the things, all those together, that create the roadway for innovation. Ta-da! And I can go back to any and all of the pieces of this, the curve, the stats, how we do this. And maybe we both will answer some questions, because I've been so impressed since I moved to Colorado with all the incredible resources. So out of these 27 things, and no company, by the way, uses 27. It's really a menu. Most companies should choose 4 or 5 of these tactics and tie them together into something that's a real humming engine. And I've been really just incredibly impressed here in Colorado with how you guys have tied everything together. And you're a huge part of it too, Vic. It's really incredible to see the depth of the resources. You hear all these studies and stuff, and you're like, those are just PR stunts. But like, really, I've found it to be incredibly true since moving here. I've only been here a year or so. Really great. Yeah.